we train to have mastery of our own mind. With me today is Master Daichin Thurman. Daichin is the founder of Graha Yoga Method, and we're going to discuss biology versus morality, particularly in the context of spiritual practices and enlightenment of the mind. Welcome to the program, Daichin.
Thank you, Jai.
All right.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So let's get right to it. There's a lot going on in society. I think when you look out there, you can see perhaps a moral crisis in terms of what to believe, what is meaningful and good. We can't cohere on what to protect and what to fight for. So it's kind of all over the place. How does the yogi look at something like this?
Well, a yogi is interested in their own causes of their own bias, right? A yogi is looking for something called a perfect action. And a perfect action is something, people have different opinions about what that means, of course, but for me it really means that it is a fully conscious choice as much as possible within the platform of the human body, right? So although the mind you can idealize the mind and the imagination as being a limitless field, right? That is free and has free will. At the same time, the biologist and the psychologist might see that we have a lot of rules and a lot of biological drivers of our decision making. Fear of fear of death, fear of hunger, fear of isolation, fear of loss of potency. Fear of loss of comfort or pleasurability. And so basically it comes down to two sets of irrational factors on our free will. One comes from morality or from social conventions or wanting to expand socially, recognizing that our survival is based on our approval from others. And the other is more raw biological survival, meaning am I hungry, am I getting older, am I injured, am I sick? And decisions that are being made before I have a chance to know where those decisions come from, the decisions are already made. And then later on I rationalize the cause of those decisions, may or may not be the actual cause.
You're talking about when they measure the brain to see if this decision has been made before it turns into an action?
Well, that would be quite a measurement. If you could somehow track that, that would be impressive. I'm not sure. I mean, I know that they have a lot of brain mapping and they know different zones of the brain are related to different types of decisions.
They can see it firing just before the action and measure it.
Yeah. So, and then, and by provoking people to make choices based on different types of choices and seeing the different types of brain, I mean, that's a really fascinating field that, a yogi has a different type of laboratory. So the yogi really more uses the body and the breath, the back bends and the exhalation, the forward bends and the inhalation. Things that are supposed to be binary and equal, but eventually are unequal. And that is a means by which the yogi becomes aware of the reflexive influence on his or her free thought, her free will, and her free decisions.
So biology, let's get into biology versus morality. When does biology trump morality?
Well, I mean, I think the way to see it is that biology is the rule set, is more based on a more consistent cycles of nature. So the cycle of day, of waking up with the light, going to sleep when the sun goes down, circadian rhythms, the annual rhythm of different seasons, so because birds are flying in a certain direction, I know it's a certain time of year subconsciously, and thus my body starts to prepare either for the winter or to prepare for the summer in those transitional states. So in many, I think when there's a surplus, when there's abundance, we tend to worry more about our social position. Okay, and some of our senses are more socially adapted senses, particularly visual sense. Um, when things get more scarce and there's more challenges like global warming in a way, or the threat of an alien invasion, or a tsunami, or even coronavirus, is something that threatens everyone. It's a force, unstoppable force of nature. And historically, people tend to work together more and collapse a lot of those social boundaries when there is a threat from nature. So that would imply that the natural reflexes supersede the moral or social reflexes.
Yeah, I thought coronavirus was enough to unite everybody, but it seems like we need more.
Well, it's true that there, you could be on a lifeboat that is sinking, and someone might decide it's in their immediate advantage to threaten to sink the lifeboat faster, unless you put them in charge, and that's called Brinksmanship, or people who really aren't thinking ahead to where everybody that they will also be drowned just like everyone else, employing that kind of tactic. So it's hard because it's not a political discussion per se, but those who are wise and refuse to engage in politics are doomed to be ruled by the foolish. And we are at a point now where humans have adapted more social reflexes to protect themselves from other groups of people than their natural reflexes of survival are cultivated. So not everybody chops their own wood, milks their own cow, sews their own clothes. All those basic survival skills are all kind of hyper specialized, or many of them are done by machines. And so then again, it becomes life in society a little bit becomes obsessively trying to stockpile and hoard money or whatever other unit of exchange that there is. At some point when humans were successful in generating food, generating shelter, protecting their young, making larger and larger population groups, but then what would eventually happen is there'd be a bad harvest, or something would happen, some cycle of nature, there'd be a drought, but you'd have a large population. And so then to feed. And so what could you really do but go over to the next valley, the next mountain range, and take the other people's stuff? And then eventually, after so many cycles of people coming to take your stuff, of being so desperate that you go on a war to take someone else's stuff, that then society had to adapt like a sort of military class or martial warrior type people whose only job would be to protect from invaders, right? And or to go and invade. And then this is a necessary boundary. Kind of good fences make good neighbors at some point. But it eventually, that process still is ongoing, and that we have adapted now to, again, prioritize our social value and our social barometers of progress above how we're interacting with nature.
Yeah. Do you get any sense now that we're ignoring biology over ideology with some of the movements or things that are going on in our culture?
Well, certainly climate change denial, flat Earth. I don't really want to go after any particular groups, but there are groups that seem to
They're veering away from science.
they fear
basic
that
science.
yeah, they're more about creating a collective group than they are about living sustainably, or that those groups get more attention than people who are doing community farming, or people who are doing community recycling, or people who are figuring out ways to source housing for the homeless, for the elderly, and things like that. People who are like rebelling against science, that's more of a failure of our education system than and all the misinformation on the internet, you know.
So practices that connect we're using our biology in it's hatha yoga is very physical, very glandular, very much mastery of the endocrine system, the nervous system, respiration. How does that get us to a place to cohere on morality, or is it a personal internal compass that you come to? One way I teach is to say that the knowledge reflected within yourself will teach you who other people are, and therefore perhaps compassion for someone else's journey can dawn. And once your needs are met, maybe you can help others or help to make a better society and some positive contribution.
That's great. I mean, yes, when you're dealing with compassion and love, you're also dealing with balances of perception of oneself and perception of others. So my compassion for other people is based on my compassion for myself. And of course, I learned to have compassion for myself by other people having compassion for me. There isn't really any way to isolate one, to say, oh, I should not care about other people's approval and then I'll be enlightened or something. Like, that's more of a psychopath, who is insensitive and doesn't have empathy, more than, to me, a description of an enlightened person. An enlightened person is rewarded by compassion to the same amount as they are rewarded by love. So everyone has a different conditioning from childhood, whether you were raised to be considerate of other people. That's one way of being raised, which is very moral. That's very good. But then it might be that those types of people can fall into people-pleasing, needing approval for others, maybe having low self-esteem, so not really applying that same compassion to themselves. Whereas other people may have a conditioning where they're really taught to love themselves and not self-sacrifice. And those people might be more opportunity-seeking type people, more loving people, but then may have a stretch in their empathy in applying that to other people. So I don't really see how, obviously a balance is the best, and being able to recognize when I'm too far out in one tendency and reversing that. Although that is always occurring in the organism through the breath, right? The breath is a somatic resource of nourishment and boundaries. Every inhale, I'm taking in nourishment, or I'm focusing on self-love. Every exhale, I'm creating boundaries, and I'm focusing on compassion for others, But then I also need compassion for myself, and I need to love others. So and in any binary, you wind up with sort of 4 points on your compass.
I've seen a lot, like I've been to many corporations, as a trainer and as someone teaching health and wellness, and I see the structure, and I've worked with all the executives. And I've been involved in some spiritual organizations and ashrams and yoga lineages. And you think that stuff the same power dynamic or the game of power wouldn't be there. It's a light brainwash you go through with the sense of, purification, which is associated with spiritual practices and organizations. But you find those same power dynamics are woven into the spiritual organization too, which is like a light bulb. And that brings me back to what you're saying about biology and nature.
Yes.
Even in these places where they give the highest teaching, Aham Brahmasmi, you are the one, you are the ever-expanding one, and everybody knows this teaching, and that teaching is experienced by many people with a long arc of practice. Is the game of power just woven into our biology because reproduction is such a strong drive?
Well, yes. The short answer, yes. You can put different faces on it, but it's still the same game. Everyone has their own distinction in terms, but you could say that spirituality is the ideal and religion is the compromise. So you have ideals that govern, your spiritual progress. Are you living your ideals? Are you being fair to everyone? Are you, caring for the self? Are you, in harmony with your environment and your relationships? And then there's the compromises. And I guess that's the question. Where do the people meet to have this spiritual meeting? They need to meet somewhere. So then there has to be a church, and then once there's a church, it has to be on a piece of property, and once it has to be on a piece of property, it has to pay tax or not pay tax or blah blah blah. And one or two generations later, the people inside the church might not be living the ideals. They might just be maintaining the hedging the compromise. And then there's this periodic revolution from religions into spirituality. I mean, there were religions around when Jesus was around. There were pre-existing religions that the Buddha based his work on. And in some ways, each of those characters is a revolutionary figure who then eventually becomes the figurehead for a hierarchy, which a few generations later might be even more despotic than the previous religion that rebel hero evoked from.
So, in a practice, how do you, it's interesting, put constraints, for example, on the most powerful, like you're developing yourself in a way, it always comes back, purification, letting go of attachment, the intense desires. The most intense desires obviously have to be fulfilled, but how do you balance those really intense desires that are rooted in biology with one sadhana, which is supposed to incinerate some of the distractions that come with incessant desire?
Well, that's a great question, and desire is the topic. Some schools have kind of renunciate philosophy that are more like orphanages and an exchange of education for renunciate lifestyle, a way of dealing with the homeless people, in a way, a contract with the homeless, some of the original renunciate vows. And then people that who choose that path, are often seen as kind of strange. Like, why would someone who, say, a princess or something, why would she leave the comforts of a palace to go become a nun and have to do menial work all day and to be purified or something? So this is, I think, important that there be a different set of parameters of yoga and different teachings about desire and how important it is for individuals within society. And again, you get to this biology versus society duality or split, where we have desires that are put there by nature. Nature makes us want certain things. And then our programming from our society programs us that we must want certain things in order to belong to that society, because that society has decided those things have value and should be earned or should be worked for or strived to get or something. And somewhere those two, over many generations, those two things, they lose some of their, they're only theoretically distinct from one another. So we can theorize that they can be separated, but in practice they're very integrated, just like our senses.
I'm intrigued by how practice, the key that I've learned that was imparted to me by our teachers and some of my earlier teachers, was to not suppress your desire, right? But to keep the fire of practice so hot, so consistent, so that you can observe the result of expressing these desires. And then what you'll see in time with enough observation is that some of the ways you're fulfilling your desires might be, if you want to look at it in a really zoomed out objective way, like you're behaving in a small selfish way, or you're being manipulative, but in the moment you might think you're not being manipulative. And in an honest practice alone, like early morning before your own self, you can say, well, I didn't like the way I behaved and that caused a little bit of drama. Of course we all recovered. And how much more of those little bubbles and bursts, and then you can approach the same desire in maybe a smoother way. And as long as you keep practicing, the observation allows you to choose how to fulfill that desire and then keep it more clean and maybe even in one stream.
Yes, yes. Well, this idea of objectivity, right? Of that, the idea of being able to see a capacity within a human to make a clear and objective choice, meaning a choice unbiased by unresolved desires. That's challenging because of the conscious and subconscious. So I might think that I'm impartial and making an objective choice, but everyone else might look at my choice in the context of what they know about me and say, oh, no, he was being biased, you know. Why would people think that yoga would help people be happier? Or when did that become a goal of yoga? Is samadhi, some definitions of samadhi is implied by many modern New Age teachers, is some type of permanent happiness that is unconditional from outer conditions, right? It's just an inner condition of just constant gratitude, so that, I don't know, even if someone comes and punches you in the face, like you just say thank you, you know, and that's so nice. I got some blood flow there. That's great. I got to see how well my blood flows out of my teeth, right? You know, but in practice, that is sort of the sign of someone who's not defending themselves, you know, and therefore requires other people to protect them. People who are too passive and too idealistic. So I think, but the reason why I think that this idea of bliss or eternal bliss got associated with samadhi is that compared to a unconditioned mind or uneducated and unconditioned mind, someone who has clarity and has some ability to self-reflect, like you were describing, to see some of their own causation of their own suffering cyclically, is probably going to feel better than someone who is just reacting to things. Someone who's just reacting to things then is completely dependent on outer conditions being pleasurable.
And then they'll play the blame game too.
And even if outer conditions are pleasurable, you then get bored of the same pleasure and you need more. There's a curve that eventually will crash, where you'll need more and more and more of the same thing to get the same amount of pleasure from it, until then eventually it becomes a loss. So the attempt to maintain that high is, there's more energy going into that than in one's own health. So yes, for me, samadhi is impartiality, okay, being in an impartial state, which isn't necessarily means you feel better about things, because we have a lot of blockages, both socially, groups of people we ignore because we can't help them, right? Why does compassion fail? Why does love fail? Like, you know, if compassion didn't fail so often, why would it be noble to pursue it? Right? So if compassion, love are our natural state and our true being, and well, why isn't that the way things are then? Right? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, why work at it if it's just who we are or something? I get that at a certain point there's a metaphor of surrender and of being content with one's efforts and of, you know, concentrating on what's good rather than concentrating on what's bad, because again, the survival brain has a negativity bias, right? It takes hundreds of positive, supportive experiences to undo the traumatic effects of one very negative experience. So samadhi for me is, in Graha Yoga, is impartiality, clarity, things like that. To aim for permanent bliss is to then kind of miss out on the whole cycle of suffering, then you get compassion, then you have joy, you have some space for some joy, and then you have love. Love is kind of when, someone else's joy resonates with you. And then there hopefully is a mutual resonance of joy, and people want to see how high they can get with another person, appreciating that, loving that other person, that person loves them back, then it's a mutual surrender. It's a surrendering to each other. But eventually this cycle needs to switch over into some compassion and some dominance, and as well as that love and that submission. So compassion is a little trickier than love, because compassion is focused on problems, causes of suffering, which means you have to then think more critically, and you have to sort of stop people from doing things. Whereas love is more about nourishing and supporting. You could a little bit look at it as a positive feedback loop versus a negative feedback loop. Now, in economy, positive feedback loop sounds good, like to create sustainable growth in certain economic theories that depend on there being constant growth in order to provide for everyone. But in biology, a positive feedback loop is what makes us sick, right? Like, my sinus nerves get irritated, so some other glands release some mucus. But then the release of mucus irritates the sinus nerve. So then the sinus nerve is irritated, so more mucus gets released. That's called a positive feedback loop. It just keeps going and gets more and more out of balance. So you need a negative feedback to block one of those two responses. You need something to stop the sinus from being so agitated, or something to stop the mucus, from releasing. So in a way, compassion includes a negative feedback loop, like stopping someone from doing something, either causing them self-harm or causing the other person harm. And then that's an element of control. Basically, it's a desire to control another person for their own good, but still that is a dominating reflex.
Can you explain, I want to back up, I can't move past desire, because personally, when they describe the three qualities of the material world, three qualities of the material mind, sattva, rajas, and tamas, I know my nature is, through my whole youth, up till well into adulthood, very rajasic, very passionate, very sensual, very full of desire, and acting on that desire. And that's been tempered a little bit by the practice. But can you explain why do masters repeatedly in different traditions that I've studied with go back to desire as the root of suffering? And then how do we slow down that suffering if desire is the root of suffering?
Well, desire is the root of suffering, for me, is a teaching targeting renunciates, people who have been separated from social competition. And usually not by choice, usually by being born second or third in a farming family, so they're not going to inherit the land. And they get education and monastic study, and they get prestige for the family within the social institutions that existed at the time, rather than having lots of children and doing lots of work on the farm. But most of those people didn't choose that role. So whose desire is the root of whose suffering? Yes, there is the suffering of change, or the idea that, we're all going to die, so what's going to happen to our memories of pleasure? What's the point of collecting lots of memories of pleasure and lots of pleasure-seeking reflexes, cultivating them if we're just going to die anyway, or eventually we'll get bored with certain things, or our pursuit of pleasure may cause us to behave in a competitive way, you know. So the desire is the cause of suffering is wrong, mostly. Suffering was there whether you have a desire or not. Suffering.
But it's obvious that what is making us happy, like we could have a great partner
Right.
and a beautiful home or something, and when that changes, when that object changes, we long for it chemically. We long for the sense of balance or connection that we had to that pleasure. It does seem to have some universality to it in terms of change. When it changes, you're left with a chemical low.
Well, yeah, and those are the highs, those are the rules of biology. You see, for me, morality is the attempt to extract an intangible plus from the inflexibly neutral laws of biology. So, you have ordinary happiness, which you're happy sometimes, but then you're not happy other times. Other times you're not even aware of whether you would classify yourself as happy or unhappy. A lot of it has to do with who we compare ourselves to, right? That in some ways, someone who has some type of extreme happiness that's not based on outer conditions, in a way invalidates everyone else's striving and struggling, right? And so, in a way, makes people feel like how can people get to that place, and what type of process is necessary? In a way, it's a cultivation of a desire to be independently happy, to be happy independent of all conditions. So the desire to be enlightened, to be happy no matter what happens to you, is a desire in and of itself. It's a desire to be more stoic, or to be more resilient, or to be more
Sattvic.
able to enjoy, extract pleasure from, ordinary experiences. And there's a lot in that field of somatic resourcing, of pleasurability, of finding where is the pleasure. Is the pleasure in the object I'm projecting it onto? Or is the pleasure inside my mind that I can just unlock it, like the law of attraction people, right? They basically want you to get into a pleasurable state, and then having that pleasurable state attracts the objects that carry, are preferred, or the preferred objects.
Yeah, for me, all of the effort and observation is to have some say in how my life turns out. Like that's the pleasure I get from practice. I obviously enjoy the benefits of physical practices because I'm so connected to my body, and keeping the glands and being able to shift my state by at least having a basal level of health, and knowing that if I use my breath, if I take care of my body early morning, that I'll have a chemically induced positive day. And over time, those things maybe, because I come from very humble beginnings, and my animal urge is to do something better than where I come from. So these practices have variable ways of perceiving that when I make a choice, when I'm about to make a choice, I go, oh, there's one choice. But now, with all of my training in NLP, yoga, meditation, fitness, strength training, shamanism, I see variability, and I have this thing of like, well, what is the better action? Like recently reconnecting to my early mornings with Ashtanga yoga is a way to reboot my mind and anchor myself to a time in life where my drive was wicked focused. And I want to make a step from being an in-person yoga teacher to a teacher who makes money when he sleeps, rather than going to each home every day.
Yes.
It's something I don't want to do forever in that manner.
Right.
So I want to transition. So it takes this like grinding effort, but to me it's like the application of effort and will could have a better outcome. And that's pleasure that I connect that pain. It's painful to
Yes.
sometimes wake up so early.
Sure.
It's painful to sit at my computer 6 hours a day and write ebooks and embed links in them for products I've created. It's a grind, but to me, the pleasure is in the grind, and it's in saying,
In the
well,
quest,
I've made
in
something.
the pursuit.
The
Yes,
pursuit,
what
right?
you're willing to give up.
Yeah,
Right?
and so-
What in the short term you're willing to give up in pursuit of something greater, even
And there's
though
been a refractory period.
that result is uncertain. You
Yeah.
have to tolerate uncertainty in order to take that approach.
But I see at 45 that applying this sort of mindset gives one personal responsibility. So I try to, as a teacher, rather than telling people that the government is going to come in and help with everything, that yes, like I had a chance to teach kids in Harlem for 2 years, and the young men got really attracted to working with me, and I gave them a teaching I got from my dad. It was obvious that they weren't getting the same education, the same resources, the same quality of food as other schools. And I didn't teach them that the system was stacked against them. I acknowledged that their life was hard. I acknowledged that it was difficult to not have a relationship with their dad, but I trained them so intensely and at times when they were suggestible. For most of the kids at work, I'm in touch with a handful of them still, to show them that effort no matter what, even though your conditions stink, and we should work to create a great starting point for all kids. But you guys don't give me any bullshit about why you didn't succeed. Don't give it to me. You may have to work harder, and yes, it's not fair, but that responsibility through your personal practice, that's, I teach what I know and I teach what I've walked through, and I try to make the pain pleasurable. And through training them for 2 years, I was able to wire it into most of them. A couple of kids, I don't know if they didn't have an inherent biological drive, but 2 or 3 of them I didn't click. It didn't fully drive home, but for a vast majority of them. And it created leverage that they looked up to me based on my previous successes in life.
Yes.
They were able to go, all right, he's kind of role model, let me listen, and go through the training protocols. And the pitcher got better at hitting the box, the running back got faster, the quarterback could throw faster or farther, and they started to trust me. And I think that teaching was installed of personal responsibility. Your life is going to turn out based on your effort, and the practice teaches you that through measurable increments in your biology. If you're a runner and you're going around the track at 51 seconds, then you crack 50, and then you crack 49, and then you get stuck at 48 for a year, then you get world class once you crack 47, 46. It's like the body is giving you feedback, and that's what I think, in a simple way, what all of these practices are. And I never leave one in any exposition or teaching without just do your practice. It always comes back to your practice.
Well, sure. You're creating a reward system based on your own actions with just your movement, your body, your breath, some internal imagery, things where, you might be, when that hour is over, you might be in affluent social position, you might be in a developing social position, or you might be incarcerated, but you did your practice that day. You had compassion for yourself. You had love for yourself. You have some independence from the projection of society upon you, which we might think that there's some ladder to climb, but some people start out in the middle or the top of that ladder, and they work really hard, and they wind up a couple rungs down, right? They come a couple rungs down, working harder than their parents did for less money, and feeling like it's pretty hard not to feel like the game is against you in that case, because society also has cycles of expansion and contraction, tyranny and democracy, fluctuate. And in some ways, we have genetically adapted to those cycles. So your parents had certain skills that help them cope with the 80s and 70s. You know, your grandparents had skills that helped them cope with the 50s and the 60s. You know, your skills are for coping with the 90s and the past 2 decades. And those cycles are all those traits are all retained in the genes, and they come out only under physical duress, only under pressure. Did those ancestral traits come out? The advantages from different time periods. So that's the biology that comes out of the morality. And the morality that comes from the biology, and we don't know. It's a kind of eventually it's like a chicken and the egg thing. We don't know really which came first, which created what.
Okay, the chicken and the egg, one egg at a time here on the Yoga Ranch. So thank you for tuning in on a very detailed discussion of morality and biology with Master Daichin Thurman. You can learn more about Daichin at his website. Daichin, can you share your handles and where people can find you?
Sure, it's DaichinCarlThurman.com, or you can find me on Facebook or Instagram, Daichin Carl Thurman. And we'll see you next time on Daichin's Daily Dharma on YouTube.
Thanks, guys.